Hey everybody, Brian Allred, teaching pastor, New Life Presbyterian Church in Yorktown. Welcome back to our series on forgiven and forgiving, where this is now the fifth video lesson in the series, a series in which we are contemplating this important topic of forgiveness in the Scriptures. Just to review, this is a series exploring the Bible's teaching on forgiveness with an emphasis on four things. The mandate for forgiveness, which we've covered in a previous video lesson. The meaning of forgiveness, which we looked at in the previous two lessons, and then also the misunderstandings of forgiveness and the motives for forgiveness. And so those are four things we're looking at. Again, we're about halfway through those four emphases. We looked at the meaning of forgiveness in the last couple of video series, so if you happen to miss those, you can go back and look at those. But we ended up kind of landing at a definition or meaning of forgiveness that's derived from two primary Greek words that we find in the New Testament, often translated as forgiveness. One is aphiemi, and the other is charizomai. And so this is a definition that kind of encapsulates the connotative ideas in both of those Greek terms. And so this is what we used. Forgiveness is a renouncing of bitterness, resentment, and malice toward the person who wronged us, as well as letting go of claims to personal vengeance and opting for love, care, and goodness toward the person over evil. And so that's my effort at landing at a meaning of forgiveness. And hopefully that meaning is helpful. However, one of the last things we said in the previous lesson was just because we understand the meaning of forgiveness and can understand and appreciate that, yes, that's what forgiveness means. That's a biblical idea of forgiveness. It certainly doesn't make it easy. It's important for us to understand what that is. It's critical for us to understand what that is, but it shouldn't be confused that, okay, now I know what it is and I know what it means, forgiving others should be easy. It's not easy. And in fact, forgiving others is often made more difficult due to several common misunderstandings. And so what we said at the end of the previous lesson was that understanding what forgiveness does not mean is often as important as understanding what it does mean. I think my face has been a little bit better up here at the top, so I'll go ahead and leave myself up there. So we want to move from the meaning of forgiveness to the misunderstandings of forgiveness. And again, I think these are as equally important to wrap our heads around and our hearts around as it is when we talk about meaning. So we need to understand some of the ways that we go, some of the ways that we're wrong-headed about forgiveness. That makes it even harder, unnecessarily harder, because it's not what forgiveness means. These are misunderstandings of forgiveness. Lewis Smedes, I've quoted him before, says this in one of his books on forgiveness. He says, "I've discovered that most people who tell me that they cannot forgive a person who wronged them are handicapped by a mistaken understanding of what forgiving is. They would have been helped a lot had they gotten a clear picture of the process at the start. There are problems enough surrounding the particular circumstances of our individual wounds and wrongs without being handicapped with a wrong-headed idea of what we are expected to do about them. Of course, knowing what we are supposed to do is a far distance from actually doing it." So forgiveness is difficult. In fact, one of the things we're going to talk about is forgiveness from a biblical viewpoint is supernatural. It's not a natural kind of thing to extend to another. So we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about motives, that there's a supernatural element to be able to extend forgiveness to those who have wronged us, something that's empowered by the Holy Spirit. But we want to, again, have a clear understanding of what it means and a clear understanding of what it doesn't mean. So I have 7 things that I want to share with you about what forgiveness does not mean, starting with this. Number 1, forgiveness does not mean a feeling. We should not confuse forgiveness with having some kind of a feeling or a set or a complex of feelings. Forgiveness isn't a feeling. Forgiveness requires an attitude of putting off bitterness and resentment and malice, but it doesn't require warmth for the person who wronged you. And certainly not when the wound is fresh, and maybe not ever will you feel warmth toward the person who wronged you. Not feeling warmth is not an indicator that you have not forgiven them. And one of the requirements of forgiveness is not having warmth or fondness for the person who wronged you. Forgiveness is not a feeling. Again, it certainly involves attitudes of bitterness, resentment, and malice, and letting go of all of those things, but it cannot be reduced to a feeling. So feelings of fondness or feeling a renewed connection to the person relationally are not definitive indications as to whether you have forgiven or not. Even feeling anger is not necessarily a sign that you have not forgiven. Not feeling anger is not necessarily an indicator that you have forgiven. But oftentimes, anger and resentment will be there. We have to let go of that resentment. But what we do with our anger, right? The scriptures talk about the ability to be angry and not sin in Ephesians chapter 4. And so having feelings of anger, which can be prompted by injustice, are not necessarily indicators of a failure to forgive. But certainly what you do with anger, holding on to that anger, letting that anger build to resentment and bitterness and malice, and causing you to slander someone else out of anger, pulling them down in terms of their reputation. Remember, we talked about all those things that sometimes we have in our toolbox that we take out to exact personal vengeance. If we use our anger to move toward vengeance, taking vengeance for ourselves upon the other person, that's a failure to forgive, clearly by the meaning that we've already set out. But being angry in and of itself is not necessarily an indicator that you haven't forgiven. And no set of feelings, having particular feelings, is not synonymous with forgiving. Because the first principle is forgiveness does not mean a feeling. Secondly, forgiveness does not mean that you have denied a wrong has taken place. You're not denying a wrong has been inflicted upon you. That's not what forgiveness means. Forgiveness isn't calling you to say, well, you know what? The wrong never really happened. We talked about 3 ways to respond to a wrong. One way is to forgive it, and that's what we're unpacking because we believe that's the biblical approach to how to respond to a wrong. We talked about avenging it. And remember, the first one we talked about early on in one of these lessons was you can deny it and pretend it didn't happen. That's not the same as forgiveness. That's one way that we can approach a wrong against us, but it's not the only way. And in fact, it's a way that is distinct from avenging it and forgiving it. Pretending it didn't happen is not forgiving it. And so that makes forgiveness even more challenging when we're under this impression that what we're being called to do is to deny that any wrong actually took place. It's not biblical forgiveness. Forgiveness does not minimize or reinterpret a wrong. Again, it doesn't say, well, the wrong was something other than a wrong, so I'm minimizing it. I'm reducing it to something that wasn't a wrong. I'm reinterpreting it as something else. Forgiveness doesn't require us to do any of those things. It doesn't minimize or reinterpret a wrong as an innocent mistake or some kind of misunderstanding. It's not what forgiveness does. C.S. Lewis touches on this in Mere Christianity. He talks quite a bit about forgiveness. And he says this: they, meaning people that you're talking to, that you're calling them to forgive based on biblical principles, they think that if you ask them to forgive someone who has cheated or bullied them, you're trying to make out that there was no cheating or no bullying. They keep on replying, but I tell you, the man broke a most solemn promise. And Lewis's response is, exactly. That is precisely what you have to forgive. It's not an argument that what does he say here? There's no cheating or no bullying that actually happened. That's what it means to forgive. That's not what it means to forgive. What it means to forgive is to look the cheating and the bullying directly in the face and forgiving precisely that. That's biblical forgiveness. Now, something that people can get confused about, I think, sometimes, and that's when forgiveness even becomes applicable. And when we understand that, we understand how basic and fundamental this second misunderstanding is, that forgiveness clearly does not mean denying the wrong. But sometimes we might feel wounded and there was actually no wrong perpetrated, because actually sometimes we are hurt by innocent mistakes, or we are hurt by misunderstandings. And that hurt is very real, but if it was an innocent mistake or a miscommunication, the reality is you might have to work through some hurt feelings, but you actually don't have to forgive because there's no wrong that was perpetrated there. It was an innocent mistake. It was a miscommunication. Imagine if you overheard someone sharing something that you thought they were talking about you, but they weren't talking about you. And so you misinterpreted it, and so your feelings are hurt, and then you find out later that they actually weren't talking about you, but you've been hurt by this already. You still have to work through some of those hurt feelings because you were under this mistaken impression that they were talking about you, but you don't have to forgive them for anything because they didn't do anything that they didn't sin against you in any way. Maybe another example to think about this is somebody that isn't invited to a party. and they're hurt by that. But that person doesn't really have to forgive someone for not inviting them to the party. A person can invite whoever they want to a party, and you might be hurt by not being invited, but oftentimes that hurt, not all the time, but oftentimes that hurt can be born out of pride, and your pride is wounded because these other people got invited and you didn't get invited and you thought you should have gotten invited. And there are obviously some cases where people have acted insensitively or neglectfully. So again, there's nuances to all these kinds of instances that might happen, but I think all of us can wrap our minds around an instance where maybe we felt overlooked, but we really didn't deserve to be considered anyway. Now, those hurt feelings are real, that those feelings of rejection are real, and we have to work through those things. But we're not working through forgiveness. That I have to forgive someone for not inviting me to a party that they didn't owe me to be invited to anyway. It wasn't neglect. I wasn't overlooked. It's just they decided to invite a set number of people. I wasn't included among them. It hurt my feelings. It hurt my pride. I have to process this. But my processing of that and my hurt pride is not that other person's problem. Now, is it possible that that person did it out of vengeance? Is it possible that person was being passive aggressive to get back at me for something? Of course, those things are possible. But in this scenario, I'm eliminating all of those things. They didn't intend anything. Again, it was an innocent mistake. It wasn't even a mistake. It was just something unintended that ended up hurting me, and I have to process hurt feelings. But that's not an issue of forgiveness because I wasn't wronged. And all this is to say that when it comes to forgiveness, it automatically assumes that there's a wrong that's been committed. And so this whole idea that forgiveness is calling me to deny a wrong is diametrically opposed to the entire notion of forgiveness. And we can think about it like this. Let me quote Smedes first. We may think that the other person meant to injure us, when in fact we have been victims of a sheer accident. We may feel wronged when in fact we are only wounded. And I think that's a helpful distinction to make. We can feel like we've been wronged when we haven't. We've actually only been wounded. And so forgiveness doesn't come into play there. None of us forgives with 20/20 vision. And he goes on to say, I suppose that many of us have forgiven somebody who did not really need to be forgiven. I don't know if I put it exactly that way because we haven't really, well, I guess we feel like we've forgiven them, but if they didn't need to be forgiven, there was no actual wrong there to be forgiven. And he says it's probably better to forgive too much than to forgive too little. Grace can afford a bit of overspending. But the real takeaway I think there from the Smedes quote is that it's possible for us to feel wronged when in fact we are only wounded. And forgiveness comes into play when we're dealing with real wrongs, when there's sin involved. And so we can say it like this. We forgive sins, actual sins. We don't deny them. And when there is a sin, we're called to respond to it in a particular way. Biblically, we're called to forgive that wrong. But if there's no wrong that's actually been perpetrated, if we've not been sinned against, again, we may feel wounded, but we're not dealing with the category of forgiveness. We forgive sins, but we don't deny them. By definition, we don't deny that a sin has taken place. Otherwise, we're not talking about forgiveness. The forgiveness is only coming into play when there's real wrongs that are perpetrated. So forgiveness, understanding forgiveness as meaning that we deny a wrong is clearly a gross misunderstanding of the meaning of forgiveness. Maybe this is a time also to interject this, that there's a difference between saying I'm sorry and asking for forgiveness. When we have perpetrated a wrong against someone else, what we are called to do biblically is ask them for forgiveness and to have them extend that to us so that relationship can be restored. That's different than saying I'm sorry. I'm sorry, not that I'm sorry is never an appropriate expression. I've said I'm sorry to people many times without asking for forgiveness. For example, if I didn't invite that person to the party, but say I only had 6 people I could invite because there was restricted space, and that person felt hurt that I didn't invite them, but I have actually no regrets, and I didn't have any obligation to invite them as one of the 6 people that would have displaced somebody else. I might tell them that I'm sorry that was hurtful, but I wouldn't ask them for forgiveness. And I can say that I'm sorry genuinely, that I don't feel good about that. I feel bad about that. I'm sympathetic toward that. It evokes pity. And we use the word pity oftentimes in real negative ways, but pity is not a negative way to respond to something. If someone has experienced a deep loss, that should evoke our pity on some level, and it's perfectly understandable if somebody, say, is grieving a loss of a loved one, that when we see them, we can say, "I'm so sorry that happened. I'm sorry for your loss." And of course, that doesn't mean there's no idea of forgiveness connected there, because forgiveness and saying "I'm sorry" are distinct things. There's a place to say "I'm sorry," and there's a place to ask for forgiveness. And the place to ask for forgiveness is when a wrong has been perpetrated, where sin has been committed. And there, again, just to go back to what I've talked about in previous lessons, that there are really only three ways to respond to that. When I'm the victim of a wrong, I can pretend that it didn't happen. It's not biblical, not healthy, not godly. I can try to avenge it. Not healthy, not biblical, not godly. Or I can forgive it. That's the biblical route. And so, second misunderstanding is forgiveness does not mean denying that a wrong has happened. It means affirming that a wrong has happened, looking directly at it, and forgiving it. Third thing, forgiveness does not mean forgetting. We hear this all the time. Well, forgive and forget. But that's, again, an unrealistic expectation to place upon someone who's been wronged. If they're under this impression from people telling them this, or just hearing it in popular expressions, that you're supposed to forgive and forget, that just makes it all that much more difficult to actually forgive. And it's hard enough to forgive. But the reality is, to say you have to forget it, it goes beyond what we're capable of actually doing with our memories. We don't have that kind of control over what we remember or what we don't remember. All of us have things in our lives, memories that we would prefer to forget, that we can't forget. We also have kinds of things that have happened in our lives that we want to remember, but those memories fade because we just don't have that kind of sovereign control over our memories. Our memories don't work that way. They're not designed that way. And so there's some things that have been done to us that we're not going to be able to forget. But that doesn't mean that we can't forgive those things. It doesn't mean that we can't forgive the person who inflicted those wounds. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. You can remember something and still forgive. Now, again, how do we respond to that person when we remember what he or she did? That comes into play. So again, it's forgiveness is a particular way of responding, and that's, again, what I would go to here. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgiving. Let's go back to the meaning then. Forgiveness means choosing to respond to wrongs against us in a particular way. And what is that particular way? Well, that goes back to the meaning that we've talked about. This is the way to respond to it: by renouncing bitterness, resentment, and malice, as well as letting go of claims to personal vengeance and opting for love, care, and goodness over evil. None of that actually requires us to forget what happened. We can very clearly remember what happened and opt to renounce bitterness, resentment, and malice, as well as let go of claims to personal vengeance. We can opt for love, care, and goodness over evil. And so that's number 3. Number 4, that's a summary of the first 3. Forgiveness does not mean a feeling. Forgiveness does not mean denying the wrong. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. And the 4th, which we'll pick up next time, is forgiveness does not mean surrendering justice. It doesn't mean that we don't care any longer about justice, and it doesn't mean that we have no interest in seeing justice be done. But this seems like a good time to stop. We're almost halfway through. Like I said, there's 7 of these misunderstandings, and they're very important for us to understand, to get a clear picture of a fuller picture of the biblical view of forgiveness, what we're called to do and what we're not called to do when the Bible mandates that we forgive those who have wronged against us. And so we want to spend some adequate time on all of these, but those are the first 3. We'll get to, I'm not sure we can cover all 4 of the remaining ones in the next video lesson. We'll see about that, but hopefully you'll come back and join me then for those subsequent lessons. But until then, God bless. See you later.